Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Crowell. I'm President and General Counsel of ComplyNet. John Brown had asked me to talk today, and I asked John, I said, hey, what compliance topic do you want me to cover? And he said, you can talk about whatever you want. I said, I was thinking to myself, that's great. I can sit here and I can talk for hours. But then he said, you only have 30 minutes. So I guess I've got to make it a little bit fast. Just a little bit about myself and about ComplyNet. I've been a licensed practicing attorney for about 20 years now. About 20 years ago, I started working with a law firm that had a major client as being Daimler Chrysler. So I first started working with dealers through that process. There was a lot of lemon law cases. Dealers would get sued as a result, and I started to become very familiar with dealers that way. About 10 years ago, I started running a dealership practice group at a law firm, and what I started to realize very, very quickly is that dealers started to get sued over the same stuff over and over again. And there were certain attorneys out there that knew exactly what they were going after the dealers for. And lots of times you would have a consumer that was going to the attorney for one issue, but of course the lawsuit would end up being paperwork issues and things like that. So I started to do more on the compliance side, and then I got hooked up with ComplyNet about 3.5 years ago. And ComplyNet's been around for 27 years. We work with 1,600 dealerships across the country. The company started out as an environmental health and safety program in the auto industry and has evolved to all things compliance for the auto industry and for dealerships. So just before we get started here, just a quick disclaimer. I am a licensed practicing attorney in the state of Ohio. I also work with in various federal courts, but I'm not necessarily your attorney, so don't take anything I say here today as legal advice. And I'm also not licensed in North Carolina or South Carolina. But I'm going to be talking a lot about just various federal litigation and just different matters that you need to worry about on the federal level. On top of that, but when you think about your industry, you are one of the most heavily regulated industries. You have all sorts of concerns when it comes to things like environmental health and safety. And when I'm talking about environmental health and safety, I'm talking about things like OSHA and EPA and DOT. And over the past year, you've seen a lot of activity with OSHA. A lot of employees that were calling OSHA complaining about conditions, maybe as related to the pandemic. And what happens out of that is there are investigations that start to happen. Either OSHA's coming on site, they're sending you information, you have to respond to that information, you only have a certain amount of time to do it, and you have to know how to do things the right way there. This presentation is not going to focus on that, but the one thing I do want to point out to all of you is that if any of you have things like service centers, body shops, anything that's service related, your technicians that are commonly working with hazardous chemicals, they have to go through hazard communication training before they even hit the job. And there's certain requirements that you have at your dealership that you have to be very dialed in with. They have to have the right training. You have to have a written policy that's called a hazard communication policy that's on site that you can present to OSHA if they do come on site. You have to have safety data sheets that you're keeping and maintaining for every single one of your chemicals that you use. And you have to be able to document all the information and be able to produce it to the investigators. On the sales and finance side, you've seen a lot of activity that's been happening with the FTC and the CFPB. One great thing is that one of the FTC commissioners recently left, and he was one that was a big proponent for getting rid of the dealer markup as it related to interest rates. And you saw over the past year a fair credit lending case. There was a Bronx Honda case that dealt with discriminatory lending practices. It was the first time that the FTC had gone after a dealer in that capacity. We had seen the CFPB do that time and time again with various lenders, but we had not seen the FTC do that. Well, we lost one of those commissioners that was in favor of getting rid of the dealer markup, but the bad news is he's the guy that's been tagged to be the head of the CFPB now. So he's going to be very much interested in trying to get some sort of auto rule in place, and he's probably going to try to utilize the lenders to be able to do it and try to put the squeeze on the dealers through the lenders. So that's something you have to be aware of in this climate. Human resources side of things, especially when it comes to any sort of employee complaints, OSHA related. You have to be very dialed in with what you're doing there. Over the past year, you had to worry about things that you never worried about before with the emergency paid sick leave and the emergency FMLA. If you're a buy here, pay here dealer, you have a lot of things that you also have to worry about that the franchise dealers, for example, don't have to worry about. You have to worry about things like repossessions. You have to worry about what am I going to do with the property that's in the car when I repossess it? Am I making the right notices so I can go after deficiency judgments? Am I going through that process the right way, and am I properly collecting debt? On the marketing side, you have a lot of different things that you have to worry about when it comes to just advertising in general. I can't just advertise a payment under Regulation Z. That's a big no-no. If you make that sort of disclosure, it's called a triggering term, and there's other things that you have to disclose along with that. For example, what's the term for that payment? Is there any sort of interest rate that's related to that payment? Is that with approved credit? Is all that stuff spelled out to the customer? And then when it comes to just sales and finance in general, there's just a myriad of different regulations that you have to go through. And I know that this all can be very, very daunting for a dealer. There just seems like there's so much that you have to know, that you have to be aware of. But I want to try to simplify this for you a little bit. And I want to talk to you specifically about really what compliance is. So compliance really boils down to these three things. It boils down to safety, security, and transparency. And when we're talking about safety, we're talking about the safety of employees, guests, and third parties. When we're talking about security, we're talking about things like data, and we're talking about property that might be entrusted to the dealership. We're also talking about potentially containing dangerous things like dangerous chemicals or hazardous waste. And when we're talking about transparency, we're talking about notices, disclosures, and forms. So just about every regulation and law that's out there that is regulating the dealership, it all comes down to those three categories: safety, security, and transparency. And they're your obligation. They're your legal obligation, they're your moral obligation, and it's a best business practice. From the legal side, there's laws, there's statutes, there's regulations that you have to follow. Moral, it's the right thing to do, and it's what creates integrity and trust. And integrity and trust is crucial for your dealership because that's what keeps people coming back to work and also keeps the customers coming back to you. So do the right thing. It's very important for your business. But from a best business practice standpoint, it also results in things like fewer claims. And fewer claims drive lower premiums. And lower premiums mean that you have more profit at the end of the day. Every claim that you have is just profit that's going away, especially if you're hiring attorneys for litigation. That's just money that's coming out of your pocket. So, how do you drive a culture of compliance? You do it through three different mechanisms. Number one, you have to have buy-in, and you have to have buy-in from the top down. So you're starting with the executives, the managers, and all of your employees. It's important that everyone's on the same page. Collaboration, it has to be you, it has to be your professionals that you work with, and it's also vendors that you might be working with too. And I'm going to talk about one specific statute that deals with that, and we're talking about accountability. And to have accountability, you have to have documentation, you have to have insights, you need to be able to track information, and you need to have the proper focuses. So, the one thing that I really want to talk to you about today is on the security side of things. And you just had a presentation on data. Let's talk about some data again. So in 2017, Google, along with UC Berkeley and the International Computer Science Institute, they conducted a study, and they wanted to see how many Gmail accounts were being hacked. And they were looking at two primary sources for these hacks. They were looking at software, and then they were looking at phishing attacks. And what they found was that there were 13 million stolen credentials. 788,000 of those stolen credentials came from software. So they had trained the software to be smart and be able to guess people's usernames and passwords. The other, over 12 million, was from phishing attacks. People were receiving phishing emails, clicking on links, giving away credentials, and people were getting hacked that way. And that's what the study ultimately concluded. So when it comes to your dealership, being a smaller or medium-sized business, you should also know some various stats that go along with that. In 2020, there was a gun phishing tournament. It was co-sponsored by Microsoft. They're going to hold another one this October. But they were basically having hackers that were trying to get into people's systems and trying to get into businesses' systems. And there were businesses that were volunteering for this to see what the results of it were going to be. The statistics are really kind of scary when you think about it. 1 out of 5 people were basically taking the bait, and 13.4 of the total participants were actually even giving away credentials. So just think about that. If it was your business and there was a fake email that was coming for a DMS, for example, insert your username, insert your password, there were people that were doing those sorts of activities. And that's a really, really scary stat. They also found that the small to medium businesses were the most vulnerable of all of them. Federal Trade Commissions also reported that recently there were 38,561 cases of identity theft that were related to auto loans and leases. And the studies have also concluded that the Wi-Fi networks at the dealerships are especially able to be hacked, because even though you might have some sort of guest or some sort of guest access, sometimes they're password protected, sometimes they're not password protected, but they're usually also still tentacled to your main networks, and hackers can get in through those means too. Just last year, Toyota was not breached just once, not twice, but 3 different times in a 6-month period. And they kept getting hacked knowing that they had been hacked before. And this is Toyota. Toyota is very sophisticated, but they also have a lot of people. And most of the people that are getting hacked, it's because of what's happening through the email systems. And the risks here are very, very real. 68% of the people that were polled from Automotive News were asked, if my dealership had been compromised, is that a dealership that you'd want to do business with? And the answer to that is no. 68% of them said, no, I would not do business with that dealership. What's even more scary about that is different information that's come from CDK and some others has said that only basically only a third of the dealerships that are out there really have some sort of written plan in place to deal with some sort of data breach or some sort of security attack. And only 66% of them really thinks that it would actually, or 66% of them think that this would not happen to their dealership. Those 2 stats are really pretty telling, because if you don't think that it's going to happen, you're not going to plan for it. And that's why those numbers seem like they're so very similar to each other. So the one thing that you should probably recognize here, and I know that you're all sophisticated and you know this, but there are usually certain signs when it comes to phishing attacks. You might have some odd email address which requires someone to pay attention. There might be something generic like, hey, you're a PayPal customer, some sort of spelling or grammar mistake, an urgency like act now or a limited time. They're trying to get someone to act based on emotion. If an offer seems like it's too good to be true, it probably is. We all know that. Or they're asking to verify information. Think about this. If something's coming from like Amazon or from one of your banks, or looks like it's coming from them, they're not probably asking you to give away certain credentials or certain information. They should have that information. Or they're asking you to click on a link. And if they're trying to get you to click on a link, they're trying to get you to download some sort of malware or some sort of virus onto your computer. Also, if it's coming from an unknown source, that's another thing that you should be very familiar with. So here are just some examples of different phishing attacks that we've seen over the years. This one, for example, is coming from the IRS. If you ever get an email that's coming from the IRS, it's not real. It's just like when you get the phone calls from the IRS and they tell you, hey, you need to make a payment right now. It's not going to be real. I had a GM at a Toyota dealership one time give me a call and say, oh, the IRS is calling me. They're telling me that they're going to come arrest me. I need to make a payment right now. And I said, it's not real, just hang up. No, I looked up the phone number. They were spoofing the number, of course. She was very freaked out over the whole situation, but she finally got over it and realized. But it seemed like it was very real to her. I mean, everything seemed like it was legit. The phone number looked like it was legit. They had a good talk track. They knew some information about her. I think that they were trying to target her, and sometimes when they're trying to target a specific person, it's called spear phishing or spear vishing. In the case where you're talking to someone on the phone, it's called vishing and not phishing. But in this particular case, and I know you probably can't read that too well, there's different things that are kind of tip-offs. Number one, it says, Dear Taxpayer. The other one is it's talking about free money that you might be owed. There's a click on the link. And then if you really pay attention to what the email addresses are on here, it's irxt.com. It's not irs.gov, okay? It's particularly hard when you're on your cell phone to see that though, especially if you're looking at the emails on there, because you have to click on the actual person's name for it to be able to expand. So a lot of people are falling for things like this on their cell phones and not necessarily on a laptop or a desktop. Here's another example. This one seems to be a workplace survey. Basically what it's saying in this workplace survey is, hey, you filled this out and here's a free gift card that you're going to get, but you have to act now to be able to get it. Well, number one, did the person really fill out a workplace survey? It's asking for free stuff. It's saying click on a link. All of those things are tip-offs. Here's one that comes from Santander. It might be someone's bank that they're using. It's addressed to an undisclosed recipient. It doesn't use the person's name. You would think that Santander would have their name. There's various misspellings that are in the email. There's an urgency to act, and then there's, of course, asking for the downloads of attachments to happen. Just give you one more example here really quickly. This is one that appears to come from the World Health Organization. It's basically a phishing attack that's trying to get people to act relating to COVID. And there's different tip-offs that are in this one. If you look at the from address, it has a long string. It's not from who.gov, but that's one major tip-off, but you have to know where to look. It also says, Dear Sir, it's not addressed to the person. There's a click button for safety measures. Of course, it's trying to get you to click on another button, so you might download something. And then it has some misspelling. So Dr. Tedros, who's the head of the World Health Organization, his name's misspelled in one of those areas too. The one thing that I would like to point out to you, and I've done this in the past many, many times, and I've stopped doing it, is there's that unsubscribe button to a lot of these emails too, right? The problem is when you utilize that and it's a phishing attack, you might just be downloading something onto your device by doing that. Have you ever thought of that? So it's just one of those things that you have to think about, but unless you've been trained on it and you've received that training and you've gone through the exercise multiple times, you might just fall on it. We do phishing attacks on different dealerships that we do business with, and when we generally start with people, there's a 38% failure rate. After they start going through these exercises and they start to learn what to look for, that number drops dramatically. It drops to about 2%. So the number where it's almost a third of the people are failing drops down to maybe one person that's now failing, which is a great statistic, but it comes with awareness. So I want to bring this up because, we talked about what compliance is about. Compliance is about safety, security, and transparency, and we're talking about security of data right now. Well, we also talked about why you have to do this. We all know that if there's a data breach and someone loses the information, from a best business practice standpoint, that's going to be bad, right? There's going to be headlines in the paper. There's going to be people that don't want to do business with you. Thankfully, most people have very short memories, and hopefully one day they'll come back, but the short-term losses are probably going to be significant. There's probably going to be a lot of payouts. Hopefully you have enough in cyber coverage. By the way, the cyber coverages are going way up. I'm sure that you've seen this in the news constantly, that there's one data breach after the other. And a lot of the insurance companies now, when it comes to the cyber coverage, they're starting to require multi-factor authentication on almost every single one of the various programs that you're using that are warehousing non-public personal information. So you're going to see those cyber premiums start to rise, especially if you don't have the multi-factor authentication. And some of the carriers aren't even awarding the cyber coverage unless you have that type of coverage in place, or they're reserving the right to, if there is a breach, to not provide you with coverage if you don't have multi-factor authentication on your various systems that are in place. So this is the heart of the FTC Safeguards Rule. And the FTC Safeguards Rule, of course, was created because the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act empowered the FTC to be able to come up with different rules when it comes to protecting non-public personal information and personally identifiable information of customers of financial institutions. Now, you as dealers are all considered to be financial institutions. Why? Well, if you're a buy here, pay here dealer, you really are a financial institution. You're providing people with credit, but just your ordinary dealer is regularly assisting dealerships or assisting customers with obtaining credit, and therefore you fall within the definition under the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act as a financial institution. So the FTC came up with these rules, and the FTC says that you have to designate people at your dealership or at your financial institution to basically be in charge of your information security program. So that's number one. Number two, you have to identify the areas of risk at your business. And one of the things that it does say in there under the second section is section B and then 1 is that you have to consider as a part of that analysis of your risks, you have to think about things like employee training. What sort of employee training are you going to be providing? And right now, are you providing that type of training to your employees? The answer is probably no in most circumstances. The other thing it says under C is that you need to also look at ways to implement safeguards at your business, and you also need to test your key systems for vulnerabilities. How are you going to test, for example, your email programs to make sure that people aren't falling for phishing attacks? This is all stuff you need to think about when it comes to complying with things like the FTC Safeguards Rule. Now, you're not going to find as much enforcement coming from the FTC necessarily unless there's a big data breach that's happening. But what you do have to worry about is you have to worry about the plaintiff's attorneys that are coming after your business if there is in fact a data breach. And most of the time, if they are going to bring some sort of lawsuit, they're going to base it on some sort of negligence claim. They're going to say that you didn't exercise ordinary care under the circumstances, or they're going to point to some sort of regulation like this one and say, hey, you weren't doing the things that you were supposed to. That's what we call negligence per se, when you're not following a statute that you need to, and it results in damages. The other thing that I would like to point out to you is that when it comes to the doc fees, and in particular in South Carolina, and this comes directly from the South Carolina Department of Consumer Affairs. I know that the CIADA has forms that they sell that are compliant with this, and it talks about the disclosure of the doc fees, and they have the correct forms for both North Carolina and South Carolina. But the South Carolina one in particular talks about why those doc fees are being charged and what sort of things are being charged along with those doc fees. And there's really only 5 things that can be considered for the doc fees, but 2 of them have to do with complying with regulations like the FTC Safeguards rules, but the other one specifically, the 4th one specifically talks about trying to protect private personal information. So you're collecting a doc fee, And as part of that doc fee, you're basically saying, hey, I'm doing these things. And one of them is trying to protect private, personal information. Think about how you could potentially be at risk if you do have a data breach or there's some other information that's given away, and here you are charging that fee to a consumer. That could be a potential liability that a savvy plaintiff's attorney could potentially try to use to say, hey, we're going to try to get back that fee, not just for this person, but for a bunch of people. And I hope you all have arbitration clauses that help protect you against class actions. And I know that that's another form that the CIADA can help you out with. So here's just some basic takeaways, some things that you can do to try to protect yourself from some sort of, cyber event. And it all starts with, having some sort of awareness training when it comes to your employees. And you don't have to use a compliance provider necessarily for that. You just need to make sure that you're coming up with some sort of process so when you're hiring people that they have the right training. This shouldn't be the only type of training that you're providing people with. You should be providing them with all sorts of other training so they know how to properly make disclosures when they're selling a car, or if they're the ones that are in the finance department, or if they're technicians, that they have the proper training when it comes to OSHA and EPA sort of issues. But you should have some sort of training and awareness with your employees. You should also have a written plan. You're required to have a written plan that's talking about how you're going to deal with both protecting information and, if there's a data breach, what you're going to do. There's other things that you can be doing in this process. One of the big ones is working with your IT providers to make sure that they're providing you with the proper, antivirus software and those sorts of things. The FTC safeguards rule does, in fact, require you to make sure that you're using vendors that are also protecting the information the same way that you do. That's one of the ways that the CFPB has really gone after these lenders by basically saying, hey, anyone that you're working with, they have to do all the same things that you're doing. You're basically liable for anything that they're doing. And the safeguards rule, that fourth part to the safeguards rule, is that any vendors that you're selecting have to use the same sort of processes and procedures or the same sort of security that you do. And then the fifth one is that you need to constantly reassess your program and make sure that you're doing all the things that you can do to try to protect yourself. And then, of course, the last one that I would really like to touch on before we're done here today, and so I can meet my time limit that John had put on me, is to look at what your cyber liability insurance policy is right now. Most dealers are woefully inadequate in the amount of coverage that they have right now. And up until here recently, that coverage has been pretty cheap. You might want to just check with your insurance provider and try to look at what the limits are. But if you have less than $1 million in coverage, and you have to look at how many deals you're doing and make some determinations on what that's going to be and talk to your broker about that. But usually $1 million just doesn't go very far. I mean, you're talking about potentially having to notify every single one of your customers if in fact there was a data breach, because they're probably getting in your system, they're probably going back, and they're probably looking at the information that's been in your system. On average, how much data are you keeping in your system? I would say you're probably keeping at least 7 to 10 years, depending on what your accountants are telling you when it comes to data. You shouldn't keep too much data beyond that, though, and the reason why I say that is because not only is there the FTC's safeguards rule, but there's also a disposal rule, and the disposal rule says that you only keep the data for as long as you legitimately need it. So you have to have a legitimate business need for keeping that data, and just keeping the data because, hey, I might want to use it for something someday isn't good enough. You need to have a legitimate business need. And part of that comes in making sure you're disposing of that data correctly. You might need to hire some company to come in and take a laptop, properly destroy it, make sure that information's coming off of there. Certainly using secure servers. Most people are living in cloud environments now, but you need to make sure that your cloud providers are having the best security mechanisms, and your DMS companies are using the best security procedures in place. Make sure that you're asking a lot of questions about that. So with that said, this is kind of the end of the presentation. Does anyone have any questions? Mr. Brown. Say that again, the profiteering? Oh, I was actually talking about profit protection. So what some people miss out on when it comes to your insurance renewal, you should really be focusing on your compliance efforts and letting your broker know all of the things that you're doing from a compliance standpoint with your insurance company. And the reason why you should be doing that is because, just think of it this way, if you're an insurance company and you have two dealerships that you're looking at, and one has a robust compliance program in place and the other one doesn't, so one's being very proactive and the other one's not, if you're that insurance company, which one would you rather insure? You'd rather insure the one that has that solid program in place. And there are plenty of insurance companies just based on some basic things that you could be doing, some basic trainings that you can be providing. Maybe it's things like sexual harassment training or discrimination sort of trainings. Those can sometimes get you automatic deductions on your premiums. Some insurance carriers will provide you on things like EPLI coverages and cyber coverages, maybe a 10% discount just for making sure that your employees are going through that sort of training. I can't guarantee that. They're all a little bit different, but we do see it time and time again. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much, everyone.